have returned. I'm the Nerd King from Band League, and I'm going to be breaking down the Pro Tour Kaladesh. I'm doing a metagame analysis, so we're going to look at the big decks from day 1, how they converted to day 2, the decks that placed in the top 8, and see how it all applies to what you should put in your decks. So, our day 1 metagame was all over the place. As you can see, this is the other category right over here, and I put any deck that 10 or less people played in this category, and yet it still beat the most popular deck, and it's about equal to the first and second decks combined, which just proves how all over the place this format is. Even the pros are just all over the board. And so the biggest deck going into the tournament was Temur Aetherworks, which is a combo deck built around the new card Aetherworks Marvel, and you just generate a bunch of energy and take the biggest Eldrazi off the top, which you get the cast trigger off of, and you basically just win from there is the theory. And then we had things like Black-Green Delirium, which was in our old standard, and a few fairly generic decks like Black-Red Aggro with its Unlicensed Disintegration and Red-Green Energy with Voltaic Brawler. Things like that. Red-White Vehicles is over here, which was a deck many people expected, running the Dwarf Synergy. And so, keeping that in mind, we go to day 2. And so, the other category is over here. And as you can see, it's really been reduced from here, where it's 28.3%, to here, where it's 21.8%. However, that's still not as large of a reduction as I would have expected, for considering that these are just random decks that few people played. The other thing to consider is because there's less people overall, I lowered my I increased my standard for what goes under other, and so now with this pie chart, it has to be 5 or less people played it. And yet, it still pretty much compares. And so, again, Temur Aetherworks got in with a slightly better conversion rate. But as you can see, it's very similar pie chart. Like, normally with a Pro Tour, the day 2 decks are way more straightforward than the day 1 decks, but it's still pretty all over the place with like 10 decks or something, probably more. And so, with that in mind, we can basically assume from this that we are in. So there's 2 types of formats. There's the kind where there's only a few decks, and the good players are the ones that make the best decisions, and every little decision in a game really counts, and that's what brings up your win percentage. But this is strongly suggestive of a game where it's more about metagaming and sideboarding. So predicting the decks that are gonna be in the meta, and then building your sideboard and sideboarding appropriately to beat them. And so, but aside from that, that's pretty much all we can tell. Another interesting thing is, Jund Delirium and Temur Colossus have actually had high enough conversion rate that they managed to get from the other category into the, into their own slots. They're admittedly still fairly small, since there were only so many people playing them. Like, here's Jund Delirium, and Temur Colossus is right over there. But it's still really impressive, considering that less than 10 people played them, and yet there were still more than half of them going into day 2. Alright, So here's the top 8. And some of it was predictable. For example, the Temra Aetherworks deck over here. This is a Mardu Vehicles deck, which it's a little weird. Because in both of these two, it was in the other category. Because so few people played it. And yet, it managed to get all the way to the top 8. And I'll admit, I wasn't very up on it. I don't know where it ended up placing overall. But still, apparently, it was a much better deck than people thought it was. We also had Blue-Red Energy, which, if you go back to the Day 2 conversion, was right over here, which, decent amount. But it wasn't one of these ones that you were going to really expect to show up in the top 8. Another interesting thing is that none of these decks appeared twice. Like, yeah, there's a couple control decks which you can lump together, and there's 2 vehicle decks. But there's still different colors and whole different takes on the archetype, which is really weird. Like, in Pro Tour Theros, to use an extreme example, Mono Blue wrecked the tournament and was a significant part of the top 8. But here, it's just all over the place. There's only one Aetherworks deck. There's a Blue-Red Energy. Blue-White Flash Spirits. It's a spirit-based deck using things like Spell Queller and Rattle Chains to be super fast and flashy. And then we have Red-White Tokens, which it's another deck that was in the other category, hiding away in there. And yet it made a big showing. And you're probably, when I first looked at it, I thought, oh, it must be humans, or it's probably vehicles. But in reality, it is actually its own deck. It's a different archetype. And so, all this, first of all, control is clearly really strong. Because it's not obvious at first. Because you're like, well, they're only like a fourth of the top 8, and there's all these other aggro decks like Blue-White Flash, the vehicles decks, some just tons of various aggro decks. Why do you think control is good? Well, the key is this. Control decks generally don't make a strong showing at the Pro Tour. The reason being that when you don't know the meta, it's hard to balance your removal properly. For example, how many board wipes do you really need? Are we going to run into vehicle aggro decks? Or are we going to run into go wide aggro decks? And what kind of removal? Do I need to worry about killing little guys? Are big guys more of a problem? How much do I need to worry about lumbering falls? All these things are still questions going into the Pro Tour. So control generally doesn't make a strong appearance. And yet here we have 2 control decks making it into top 8. And if we go back here, you'll see that Jeskai control was 3.8% going into day 2. And there's a few other control decks in here. Oh, never mind. I'm wrong. Yep. But then again, we're surprised also by the fact that this Grixis control deck made it. Alright, now what we have to consider is how good, because now we're thinking about how control is going to look, and it's looking pretty good. So the next question is, where do these other decks fall? Well, Aetherworks was about an 1/8 of the meta. About an 1/8. And people were expecting it, and they were playing Ceremonious Rejections and some cards that beat it. But I still expect Aetherworks to go down. And the reason is, it's a combo deck, and I do think it has a place in the meta, for certain. But I just don't think that this number, the 18.8 up here, is really representative of where it will end up being. And see, it's a deck that, even if you know kind of what's up, it's hard to beat any combo deck at the Pro Tour, just based on what you're guessing they'll run. Because they can do weird other things, and it's hard to know exactly what version you'll face. Like, you can't see it here, but in that other category, there are a lot of versions of Aetherwork decks that only a few people ran. And so, even if you prepared for Temur, you might get caught out by one of those decks. And so, now, I think moving forward, Aetherworks will still have a place in the meta, and even the hard combo version of Aetherworks. But I think that overall, Aetherworks will have to adapt to survive, especially in a control-based meta. And so, it will end up being... It could be many things. It could be because usually when a combo ends up in Standard, and often even in Modern, you want a sub-theme, an alternate win condition. For Splinter Twin, it was Control. For an older combo, or this wasn't a true combo, but it was very similar. Back in, I think it was Avacyn Restored meta, we had Unburial Rights and ramp cards, and so we ended up with a lot of recursion decks that had a ramp backup plan. And so I think Aetherworks needs a backup plan to survive. Now, with all the big Eldrazi, I think of two possibilities. Either it's gonna go and become a control-based deck where it runs counterspells to stop other people's counterspells, like Dispel and Ceremonious Rejection, or it's gonna go more aggressively oriented and become a ramp deck. Now, of those two, I think the control version is more likely, because sadly, there just aren't the ramp tools that we used to have. Like, we lost a big card in Rampant, what was it? Explosive Vegetation, that's it. That was a massive hit to any ramp deck. And we lost a few other somewhat less important cards, but it's still become a lot harder. Now, on the other hand, we did get Primal Druid, which is a good card for the ramp decks, and I think it has a chance at seeing play. So we'll still see. But I think the other thing I find appealing about the control deck variant is that Temur Aetherworks has instant speed, which is really nice in a control shell, because then you can not do it on your turn, where you have to risk more. Because if you do it at the end of their turn, you dodge all the sorcery speed removal, like Declaration in Stone. And then you're able to... So by dodging that, you've kind of almost saved yourself some spells. You can play it, let it resolve or something, and then draw cards when they don't do anything about it, which is awesome. And so it's not a huge upside. You could probably get by even if it were sorcery speed, and it might be. I could be totally wrong, by the way. But still, it makes it slightly more appealing to be in a control shell. Alright, now, so getting into more of my personal opinions. So, Rotation, Kaladesh comes out, and the biggest question is, how many of the old things we used to have gotten worse, and how many of them have gotten better? The number one important thing to beat in this meta, aside from maybe Temur or Aetherworks Marvel, is Smuggler's Copter. And getting an answer to that is will be a lot of the battle against aggro decks. And because 3 damage removal also destroys a lot of their other creatures, if not all of them, it's extremely valuable in the meta. But our options for it are fairly limited. We have Harness Lightning, the new Kaladesh card, which is energy based, which is super sweet. And we have Incinerary Flow, which, here's what I like about Incinerary Flow. Recently, there's been a bit of a, like, resurrection of the, Scrap Heap Scrounger decks. And so, destroying that and destroying the prized amalgam permanently makes Incinerary Flow a lot more valuable in my mind. And so, additionally, it's instant speed and goes face. And just so many reasons that this card has become better. Now, does it still beat Harness Lightning? I can't confidently say that yet. It depends on how much of the prized amalgam and decks and the Scrap Heap Scrounger decks we end up with and how valuable going face is. But I could see it as a possibility, especially non-energy based decks. Alright, so Galvanic Bombardment. I'm not sure how to assess this card, to be honest. It appears here on the 3 damage removal, it appears here on the 2 damage removal, and it appears under the instant speed removal. I just don't know where this card's gonna fall. It could be amazing, it could be terrible. I think it'll really depend on the meta. Because the problem with Galvanic Bombardment is that it's not a Smuggler's Copter answer. The good thing about Galvanic Bombardment is it does answer other things and really efficiently. It's better than a Shock, which is basically the best we can ask for in Standard these days. And so, I'll be watching it carefully. Let me put it that way. We'll see where it goes. But I think it'll either be great or it'll be terrible. I don't think there's an in-between because of the nature of the card that you either play 4 of it or you play none. It's a card that can't be just okay. Alright, so Essence Extraction. This card is tempting me because it's instant speed, which I love, which I'll get to soon. And it's also 3 damage. But the thing that bothers me about it is not only is it 1 mana too expensive, it's also double color. So I think it's bad, but there's a slim chance that this format goes in the right way where there's a lot of aggro and we care all crazy a lot about that life, and it just manages to sneak into the format as one of the best, as one of the premier removal spells. So yeah, that one's interesting me. The Grixis control deck that made the top 8, this one over here, it was running a 1 of Essence Extraction, which is why a large part of the reason I even considered it for this list. Alright, sorry, I'll stop reviewing every single card now, but I felt that these 3 damage removal spells were really important to consider the pros and cons of each one. Oh, sorry, one more thing that's really nice about Essence Extraction is that it's black, for just in case you want to make a red deck. Or not, sorry, if you want to not make a red deck. Alright, so next important thing is, I don't know if you noticed this, but almost all of the big Kaladesh threats cost 5 mana or more. Think about the Gear Hulks, for instance. And so, all of a sudden, we've gone from a world where you're making a special effort to play cards that cost 5 to get around Spellqueller, to a world where just, rather than shaping the meta, Spellqueller is getting pushed out of it by better cards. And so, that's why, jumping down here for a minute, it's on my What's Become Worse page. There's just so many other things to do that I don't think it's going to be very relevant. If Spellqueller gets too big, then everyone will just switch to the 5-drop spells, and Spellqueller will just have to disappear again because it's just a 3-mana 2/3 flash flyer. That said, it'll always see a play in the blue-white Flash Spirits deck, obviously, because it is still a good card. It's just not great. The other thing I don't like about it is I listed how great all these removal spells would be because they hit that magic 3 damage. So if those are going to be played a lot, then I think that Spell Queller just diminishes in value even more, because it just gets 2 for 1 so easily, costs mana efficiently. So, anyway, that's why I think counter spells that hit high cost targets are going to be worth a lot more all of a sudden. And so, a brief touch on Ceremonious Rejection. This might be the best counter spell that's currently standard legal. It counters Temur Aetherworks, it counters Smuggler's Copter, it counters counterspells for the Counterspell War because Void Shatter and Spell Shrivel are colorless. It seems really, really good to me and well positioned. I think every deck that runs blue is gonna be running at least one main board unless you're really heavy aggro. It's really surprised me how colorless oriented this format has turned out to be. Alright, so my next focus is Ruinous Path and Anguished Unmaking. And so I'm about to get to instant speed removal. And so it seems ironic of me to say that Ruinous Path got a lot better when I'm also naming all these also expensive 3-mana removal spells, because they're instant speed. But here's the thing about Ruinous Path. We don't have nearly all the Planeswalker answers we need, and almost every deck in the top 8, if not all of them, is running at least some. Like, even the aggressive red-white aggro deck type things are still running Gideon, because Planeswalkers are just too good right now. And so, if you really are serious about control, or probably in most mid-range decks, you're willing to pay a premium for both of these cards. And I think Anguished Unmaking especially just spiked, because it's both instant speed and kills Planeswalkers and kills whatever else you want. It's also a Temur Aetherworks answer, and I'm starting to run, and the 3 life just all of a sudden doesn't seem like a huge cost. You think it's a lot. It is, especially in an aggro-oriented format, possibly, but it's just not that bad when you see all the things you can do with it. So I think Anguished Unmaking and Ruinous Path will probably go like a 2-1 split in favor of Anguished Unmaking, but we'll have to see. It could definitely go in favor of Ruinous Path, depending on even more specifically what the format looks like. Surprisingly, I actually think the more aggro decks we have, the more valuable Ruinous Path will be. Even though you want instant speed removal to take care of like Smuggler's Copter, Ruinous Path is just so powerful to stop Gideon and even other things when you need to. So I guess the way to break it down is the more aggro we see in this format, the better Ruinous Path is. But if we're not seeing enough aggro to justify it, I just want Anguished Unmaking. Alright, so as kind of alluding to this earlier, instant speed removal is really good right now. We have a ton of manland, which admittedly not all of these hit, but still it's important to consider. And we have tons of vehicles, and we have a bunch of token producers which you'll want to respond to, and we have things like Ishkana, and the control decks you'll want instant speed removal to play around when they draw cards, and just all over the place, tons of reasons to go out there and be fast with your removal. And so the biggest card that it's been terrible in the past, and yet I think it spiked in value dramatically recently. Because most of these we knew would be good, like Unlicensed Disintegration or Blessed Alliance, and then some of these are just still going to be terrible, like Murder or To the Slaughter. But Stasis Snare has really changed a lot for the better. And the reason is, Declaration in Stone is sorcery, it doesn't net you card advantage, and it gives the opponent artifacts. And it's still going to be good, no doubt. But it's just a lot less good. And so if we can have another white removal spell that's decent, instant speed, and hits most of the things we care about, I'm willing to pay an extra white mana for it. And that's exactly what Stasis Snare does. Alright, so now one thing leads to another, and you realize that instant speed draw, our next topic over here, gets a lot better if instant speed removal got a lot better. They're really strongly tied, and that's even true in mid-range decks. Like, that's why Succumb to Temptation is on this list. If, like, you need that instant speed has gotten so much more powerful that it probably won't again, but Live Fast and Painful Truths are both sorcery speed, and Succumb to Temptation is not, which makes you think about what Succumb to Temptation could end up being. It doesn't, and I think that control decks have better tools, this Anticipating Glimmer over here, so I think that Succumb to Temptation will probably be, or not probably, it may be the mid-range tool of choice for card draw. Because think about this. If you're less than 3 colors, you can't play Painful Truths instead of Live Fast. But then you might not care about energy, and all of a sudden Succumb to Temptation is all that's left. It's just, the options go downhill fast with just a few conditions. And even, like, as long as you don't care about energy, I think there's a chance you'll want Succumb to Temptation. The Succumb instant speed is really powerful. Is it worth more than draw a card, lose a life? No. But is it more than draw a card, lose a life with color condition? Maybe. And so I'll be interested. I think it'll probably go nowhere, but we'll see. It could pull something off, especially in 2 or 1 color decks. Alright, now this card gets a topic all by itself. It's a very important card because of just this one little tiny little statement that makes it so much better than Mind Control in this format. And that is Artifact Aura. And just stealing an Aetherworks Marvel, or another card I haven't talked about much yet, but sees play in the blue-red energy deck, Dynavolt Tower, are both so powerful and can really lock down games, assuming you let your opponent have them. But if you take them, both of them can be powerful in any deck, and that's the magic of it. They're both do the 2 things that really just frees you to steal them and gain benefit from it. And that's, they both are self-sustaining. Because normally with the Aetherworks Marvel decks, you don't care to use Aetherworks Marvel to generate its own energy, but it can, and so that means when you steal it, you're totally free to generate as much energy as you want with that, and grab creatures. And if you're a control deck, which is presumably what would be running Confiscation Coup, you'll almost always miss. But if you hit, you've saved yourself a whole lot of mana and trouble, and all of a sudden, just out of nowhere, they have a torrential Gearhulk or something staring them down. And that just can change the game so much. All of a sudden, they played their Aetherworks Marvel, but you were on the play, and so you just Confiscation Coup it away. And now the whole game has changed sides. Suddenly, they're the ones who have to react to what you're doing. It's not a main deck card, Confiscation Coup, but I think it's going to be a very valuable sideboard tool against Blue-Red Energy or Aetherworks. See, the nice thing about grabbing Dynavolt Tower 2, actually some control decks were running Dynavolt Tower because it's so good at just cleaning up the board state. Sweepers are nice, but the problem is, in this format, we have so many vehicles decks. If you look at this breakdown, and there were 2 in the top 8, so we know that vehicles is going to be a relevant archetype, and sweepers are terrible against vehicles. Like, yes, they can't pilot anything, but if all it takes is one creature, and suddenly you have more, scaling pressure. Like, they draw a 1-drop, like Thraben Inspector, and suddenly they're digging your grave with it when it just casually mans a smuggler's copter, or maybe and sacks the clue, or maybe it mans a smuggler's copter which goes off and mans its own fleet wheel cruiser. That is the power of just one creature left. But see, the Dynavolt Tower has this insurance, because if you have Dynavolt Tower out after you sweep and they play a guy, you're like, oh yeah, sure, no problem, it's dead. And so then they can't do anything with their new creature, and even you don't kill it on the spot. You just force them to realize that if they crew anything, the thing they crew is dead. It kills vehicles, which it's one of the things that control decks desperately need, and one of the reasons I like this instant speed removal. So that's why I think Confiscation Coup might be not really a sleeper, I wouldn't say, because it was being played, but a good sideboard card that's probably better than people would think. Alright, so now for the less exciting part. It's time to look at what got worse. So a lot of these cards were bad anyway, but 2 damage removal is just so bad right now. It's hard to even describe how bad 2 damage removal is. It does kill Toolcraft Exemplar, but that's it. Even in the vehicles deck, which is full of little guys, it's like Inventor's Apprentice is almost always going to be out of range, and sure, you can kill my Thraben Inspector, but it leaves a clue behind. Things like that. DePaula doesn't die to it. And so you have to just leave these behind. They aren't good enough, except maybe Galvanic Bombardment, which I kind of talked about before. But all the rest of these are just... Oh, sorry. They're just completely worthless. And so, sadly, I had high hopes for Dayan. I thought it might be able to do something. But it can't. Don't get your hopes up. Because it's like a 2 damage removal spell. It just hits for 2, and then it's done. It can get in for more with energy, but I don't really care to invest more energy into killing something which I could have killed in the first place with one of these up here or something. It's sad, but it's the truth. 2 damage removal has just creeped its way out of the format more and more. It's, yeah. So, anyway, we already talked about Spellcaller some. It's just a body that is gonna end up dead a lot. It's a decent flyer, it's neat that it has flash, but ultimately it doesn't do enough anymore. Alright, so this is the big thing that's become worse, and it's really changed the way the control decks looked going into the Pro Tour. Now, disclaimer, I listed it here because it is a sweeper, but Radiant Flames did not get worse. It actually got better in my opinion. This is an incredible card. Because even against the vehicles deck, it's a 3-mana kill tons of stuff. But the key is to look at Radiant Flames less as a board wipe and more as a removal spell, and you'll start to understand why it's the exception to this. Alright, so the problem with sweepers, the big change that's happened, is the vehicles deck. And so the aggro decks are vehicles. The spirits deck has flash and selfless spirit. And selfless spirit can even have flash, which can just blow out your plan. The control decks don't care. Aetherworks kinda cares, but not really, because it's already netted a bunch of value off the Eldrazi, and it doesn't. And Aetherworks isn't affected by any of the sweepers in standard. And even blue-red energy can just get by with Dynavolt Tower and spells. So we have to look objectively. This doesn't mean play no sweepers. It just means you have to think they aren't good anymore. They're not. It's not like I wanted to jam my deck full of these just because there's a bunch that I could jam. Really, Fumigate stands at a 2 of with another one in the sideboard for the humans deck, in my opinion. Radiant Flames is probably a 3 of. Kozilek's Return is terrible. So here's the problem with Kozilek's Return. It's still gonna be okay in the decks that want it, can trigger its bottom ability. But it's just 2 damage is not enough in this format, for the reasons I talked about with the 2 damage removal. The difference between 2 and 3 has gotten massive. And considering Kozilek's Return only does 2, I don't want it. And the biggest problem is most of the decks that do want it haven't made all that much of an appearance. If you look at the Teamer Emerge deck, it's 5.1% day 2, and sorry, one sec. And alright, I'm wrong. It was actually much less before. But still, the Emerge decks have not been that powerful compared to how powerful everyone expected them to be, considering Collected Company just left and they didn't really lose anything. I was expecting it to fall maybe in this range over here, which would have made it a serious contender. But the reality is, it's just not quite there as a deck. And even when it does, Kozilek's Return is good in it, but it's not exactly the effect Emerge was looking for. And it can get by without it. Now, it'll still play it, still be good. It's just not as good as it was. It doesn't clear everything. So, that's the main problem with Kozilek's Return. Alright, Fumigate is just your general solid board wipe. It does general solid things, and there's really nothing to complain about. Shrugs. Yeah. 5-mana board wipe is about the best we'll get. So, I'm not going to complain about possibly gaining some life for it. Alright, Descend Upon the Sinful. I read an article talking about this, where he said it was probably better than Fumigate. I thought it was going to be great, but then I realized that Delirium is harder to turn on than I thought it would be, especially in a control deck. And so, descending on the Sinful, I don't really care about the Exile, except against the Scrap Heap Scrounger and Prized Amalgam deck. The 4/4 Angel is meh. It can be good, but I'd rather just run another win condition if that's what I'm looking for. Or maybe even I could play a pseudo sweeper that I don't have on this list, but it's a Crush of Tentacles, I believe it's called. And it seems so much better than Descend Upon the Sinful, especially with the Rise of Anticipate as an instant speed draw spell, where I can just go on my turn, because Anticipate is cheap, I just go Anticipate Crush of Tentacles, and all of a sudden I have an 8/8, their board is empty, and I barely lost anything compared to if I had used Descend the Sinful for it, even with the Delirium. Alright, so that's pretty much my metagame analysis. We'll see where my predictions fall. I guess overall, I'm thinking that the biggest deck will be the either Jeskai control or Grixis control that appeared in the top 8. But next, I think actually Vehicles will be the biggest deck. I think it's probably better than Red White Humans. And just the more it settles, I think the better it'll be. There's not great ways to combat it. And DePaula is amazing at catching you back up into the game. I don't see a huge way for it to fail. And I think a lot of my predictions, going back over here, were actually based on Vehicles being a big deck. For example, the instant speed removal and the 3 damage removal. And even Confiscation Coup is pretty neat against Vehicles. And so with that, it was with that in mind that I've designed my opinions. Now, the biggest deck that I didn't maybe take into account enough, that I probably should have, was this Black-Green Delirium, which has just looked solid. It hasn't changed much, but it hasn't really gotten worse either. I think it'll catch up to Aetherworks easily once Aetherworks gets worse after the format starts to settle down and people learn how to fight it. So we'll see about that. Maybe I missed on a couple of these just because of the pure power of Green-Black Delirium. Like maybe Sweepers are better than I think because they can kill and say response to the Delirium stuff. Maybe even Descend Upon the Sinful's better, because Exile's good against Delirium, I guess. But really, I'm still going to hold to my stances here. I think this is going to be the key general groups of cards going into the rest of the format from here. And yeah, so thank you for watching. I greatly appreciate it. If you want to subscribe to our channel, it's Ban League, BHAN League, and I'm Nerd King. Hopefully, eventually, some of the other people from Ban League will start to post on there. We might get a active YouTube thing. I would greatly, like I said, I'd greatly appreciate it if you subscribe, but no pressure. Or if you don't want to subscribe, likes would be cool too, or even a comment, dude. Tell me what I'm doing wrong. But please be constructive about it. But yeah, if I need to work on something, please tell me.